In a raging winter storm, a mother dog battled death itself, carrying each of her newborns one by one to a Navy SEAL's cabin, begging the silent fire inside to save what little life she had left. The soldier thought he had shut the world out forever, until her final knock broke the walls he built after war. What he found when he opened that door wasn't just a dog. It was the reason he'd stopped believing, and the miracle that made him start again. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter pressed itself against Anchorage with the silence of something ancient and unresolved. Snow clung to every roof and roadside, fogging the horizon where the mountains hid their secrets. Michael Hayes walked the narrow trail skirting Ship Creek, the frozen river shifting beneath the ice like a beast breathing in sleep. He had chosen this path for its stillness, though even here the past clung to him like frost to glass. His boots sank softly into the packed snow, his breath rising in pale clouds that vanished before he could decide whether he wanted them to stay. Some days he believed silence was the only thing keeping him alive. Other days it was the very thing that threatened to bury him. The retired SEAL carried no weapon now, only the habit of scanning every blind corner, every leaning pine, every muffled echo of wind against steel railings. Old instincts flickered like coals under ash. He let them burn low, but never let them die. A man could go on without a team, without medals, without a sense of direction. But without vigilance, that was harder. Michael paused near a rusted sign half swallowed by ice. The storm, 2 nights prior, had left the city blanketed, muffling the world in a hush that felt almost accusatory. Anchorage was a town that remembered winter the way soldiers remembered battles, never fully healed, never fully forgiven. He tried to breathe deeper, but the air tasted like memory. A distant engine hummed somewhere behind the tree line, someone struggling to start a truck made sluggish by cold. A dog barked far off, the sound carrying clear and sharp, as if loneliness traveled better through frozen air. Michael's hand twitched toward a phantom radio that no longer hung from his shoulder. Easy, Hayes. Let it go. Yet letting go wasn't something he ever mastered. His mind, trained to survive storms that tore through flesh and steel, could not always withstand the softer tempests, the ones that clawed from inside. He reached a wooden bridge stretching over the river's narrower bend. There he stopped. Snow drifted past like ash, falling without rhythm, without hurry. The world felt suspended, no past, no future, only the sound of his own breathing and the faint creaking ice beneath. Some days he wondered how a heart could keep beating without purpose. Other days he wondered why his had refused to stop. A soft rustle snapped through the quiet. Michael's head turned before thought arrived. It happened that way, reaction first, emotion later. His gaze cut through the swirling white, searching. A shape moved under the skeletal branches lining the frozen riverbank. At first he thought the wind was playing tricks. But no, there was weight to the movement, a subtle shift of presence that his instincts recognized before his mind did. A dog emerged, though dog felt too small a word for something carrying such quiet intensity. It stepped with the rigid caution of a creature that had learned, perhaps too early. That trust was not something freely given. Michael didn't speak. Words were clumsy tools at moments like this. The animal stood still, its posture taut, its gaze fixed on him, with a steadiness that was neither fear nor challenge. Something else, something wounded yet unbroken, lurked beneath that watchfulness. Michael felt it settle somewhere in his chest, like a spark rekindling where he thought it had gone cold. He knelt slowly and unzipped his pack, pulling out a wrapped protein bar and a small canteen. He placed them in the snow between them, then backed away a step. Not an invitation, more a gesture of acknowledgement. A soldier understood boundaries. A creature fighting to survive demanded them. The dog hesitated. The wind tousled stray snow from its frame. Then, as though conceding to hunger rather than trust, it crept forward. It ate slowly, head lifting often to check him, eyes dark and deep with something that felt like memory, though he did not know whose. Michael sat in the snow, arms draped loosely over his knees, watching the dog eat. He was surprised to realize the calm he felt wasn't numbness, wasn't the protective emptiness he built after leaving the service. It was softer. He didn't name it. Naming things too early made them fragile. When the dog finished, it stepped back. Their gazes met again, just long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of it. Then, with sudden resolve, the dog turned and vanished back into the trees, its form swallowed by the snowfall as though it had never been there at all. Michael stayed where he was, unmoving, watching the space where the animal disappeared. The snow continued to fall around him, brushing his shoulders, melting on the heat of his breath. He felt the world closing in and opening up at once, like breath drawn in and held too long. He stood after a while, brushing snow from his coat. He didn't know why he whispered, "Thank you." Perhaps it wasn't gratitude, but recognition of something returning that he wasn't ready to name. Something he once believed was lost alongside fallen brothers, sealed inside letters he never sent, buried in deserts he'd never see again. He walked home slower than usual, as if afraid he might outrun the sensation still echoing in him, a sensation almost like presence, something that reminded him a person could be alone without being abandoned. At the cabin door, Michael paused, his hand on the knob. He looked over his shoulder once more into the storm. Nothing there, just silence and snowfall and the faint ache of something beginning. Inside, he lit the wood stove and sat on the edge of the worn sofa. The warmth began to gather, slow as thawing ice. He rested his elbows on his knees, fingers laced, and exhaled. That night, long after the fire softened to embers, he woke from sleep without knowing why. The room was silent, but his heart was loud with recollection, with confusion, with a faint, unsteady pull toward something beyond the cabin walls. He rose and stood at the window. Snow still fell, gentle now, like unanswered prayers, and somewhere out there he felt, without understanding how, that the animal still walked, still watched, still existed. The connection was wordless but undeniable. Michael pressed his palm to the cold glass. He didn't know whether he wanted tomorrow to come, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't dread that it would. A bruised morning light crept through dense clouds over Anchorage as the city braced for another storm, snow already drifting sideways along empty streets and frozen yards. Michael Hayes woke before dawn, as he always did, though he no longer knew whether the habit came from discipline or from an inability to rest when silence pressed too hard against his ribs. He moved around the cabin without turning on lights, sensing the room by memory instead of sight, letting his thoughts settle into the familiar low hum that arrived each morning. He tried not to think of the dog from the previous day, but his mind returned to it anyway, not because he wanted to relive the moment, but because something in that quiet encounter had lodged itself beneath his composure. He lit the stove, warmed water for coffee, stood by the window waiting for the boil, watching thick flakes move like white ash. The world outside looked unchanged, yet something in him felt shifted. He hated how easily a single meeting could unsettle walls he had spent years building. Yet the shift was undeniable, a subtle softening that arrived without permission. He muttered under his breath that he had no business giving it meaning, but he could not shake the sense that the dog had not simply taken food and vanished, that its departure carried some unfinished message meant for both of them. Hours passed quietly. Michael cleaned his gear as if preparing for a mission that would never come, his movements measured, methodical, an echo of discipline that refused to die. Memories stalked him without warning, not as visions or nightmares, but as tightness in the chest, sudden sharpened breathing, the way his hands stilled mid-motion when a distant noise echoed like something familiar. He wondered why he had not left Alaska yet, why he had not chosen sun or sand or places where winter did not reach beneath the skin. Perhaps he wanted the cold to numb what memory kept inflamed, or perhaps in some way he refused. To admit, he believed the silence here could teach him something he had never learned in uniform. By late afternoon, the storm grew violent. Wind battered the windows in steady blows, and the cabin's old frame groaned in reply. Michael added wood to the fire and checked the door latch by instinct rather than need. As he turned away, a faint sound broke through the wind. He froze, listening. Then again, clearer. A scraping noise at the door, soft but insistent, as though someone too weak to knock was begging to be heard. His heartbeat quickened without his consent. He reached the door, paused, held his breath, opened it slowly. Snow swirled inward, cold air rushing past him like a warning. At first he saw nothing, then his eyes adjusted, and he recognized the dog from the day before. It stood close enough that its breath mingled with the wind, but something about its posture was different. There was purpose now, and beneath that purpose, a weight of exhaustion Michael could not name. Then he noticed what hung gently from its mouth. A tiny shape, still breathing, but weak, a pulse of life almost swallowed by the storm. The dog stepped forward and placed the puppy into Michael's waiting hands, not reluctant, not afraid, simply trusting that he would understand. Michael felt his throat tighten, not from sentimentality, but from the raw realization that the dog had chosen him, not because he was worthy, but because he was near and capable. Before he could speak, the dog turned and ran into the snow, its form swallowed instantly by the wind. Michael shut the door, held the tiny creature close to his chest, feeling its shallow breaths against him like second-hand courage. He warmed it near the fire, fed it small sips of water, whispered reassurance he wasn't sure he believed. A strange tension took root inside him, the duty he thought he had buried, meeting the ache of purpose returning. The storm roared louder. Time passed without measure, then once more scraping at the door. He opened it faster this time. The dog returned with another puppy. The exchange repeated, the same quiet ritual, offering, trust, disappearance. Each journey looked slower, more difficult. Michael wanted to call out, to beg the dog to stay, but something inside him warned against it. Not everything could be solved by holding on. Sometimes endurance meant letting another fight their way back in their own time. Still, as he placed the second puppy beside the first, he felt frustration rising, not at the dog's choices, but at his own helplessness to lighten its burden. When the dog came a third time, snow clung to its face like frost-bitten memories. Michael knelt lower, hands shaking with something he refused to call fear. Fear was for war zones and ambushes, not for storms and dogs. Yet the feeling resembled fear in shape and texture, fear of being too late, fear of witnessing devotion crushed beneath relentless weather, fear of remembering how it felt to lose what he tried to save. Between trips, he paced the cabin like a soldier trapped between hope and hopelessness, fighting the urge to chase after the dog. He could not explain why he stayed inside. Maybe he sensed the dog's journey was more than physical, that interrupting it might shatter its resolve, and with it something fragile growing inside himself. The fourth return came with no hesitation in the dog's steps, only weariness. Michael felt a sting in his eyes. He blamed on smoke from the fire. He placed another bowl of water near the threshold, not as a trap, but as a promise. The dog ignored it and disappeared again. When it returned with a fifth puppy, Michael whispered something he did not intend. Come back again. His voice barely rose above the storm, yet the dog paused for a heartbeat, eyes steady, as if hearing what he meant rather than what he said. Hours felt like entire winters. The fire burned low. The pups slept curled against each other. Michael sat near them, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, haunted by the understanding that devotion often required breaking oneself open to the cold. When scraping echoed again, he rushed to the door with a swiftness he had not shown in years. This time, the dog looked weaker, but its focus remained unwavering. It placed the sixth puppy gently on the cabin floor and turned away without lingering. Michael watched until the storm swallowed it whole once more. The scraping did not return for a long while, long enough that Michael stood at the window, breath slow and careful, debating whether to break his own restraint and chase into the blizzard. Part of him demanded action, another part whispered patience, and somewhere between those impulses he felt his pulse steady, as if remembering what waiting felt like when life and death depended on timing rather than speed. Then at last, one more faint scrape. He opened the door almost before the sound finished. The dog stood trembling but resolute. It placed the puppy down, hesitated, for the briefest moment, and lifted its gaze to Michael in a way that made his breath catch. He did not know if that look held farewell or a plea for strength. Before he could decipher it, the dog stepped back into the snow and vanished once again. Michael remained by the door long after closing it, hand resting on the wood, forehead bowed slightly. Something inside him was changing, and he feared it as much as he welcomed it. The wind outside howled as if carrying unfinished thoughts from a distance he once vowed never to revisit. He checked the pups again, made sure each breathed steadily, then knelt by the fire, letting warmth reach his fingers while his mind replayed the day in fragments. When the storm finally eased, Michael stood, opened the door once more, and stared into the dark. He whispered into the wind without fully knowing why. He asked a question not meant for any human ear. "Will you come back again?" The wind gave no answer. But somewhere beyond the tree line, he thought, he sensed movement, just enough to keep him waiting, just enough to keep the door unlocked a little longer. The morning after the storm arrived pale and indifferent, light filtering through anchorage like a half-forgotten promise, the sky still heavy with lingering clouds that seemed unsure whether to break open again. Michael Hayes woke before sunrise, not because of habit alone, but because something in his chest refused to rest, an unfinished tension that pulled him from shallow sleep into the cold air of the cabin. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, listening to the quiet breathing of the puppies resting near the dying fire. Their presence should have soothed him, yet every inhale they took felt like a question without an answer. He had counted them twice the night before. His mind kept circling back to the same thought, though he refused to let it fully settle. He did not know how many the dog had delivered to him, how many journeys through the storm it had made, how many newborn lives had depended on its endurance. He only knew that the scraping at the door had stopped before. Exhaustion claimed the evening, and that afterward the silence had grown heavier, as if the world briefly forgot how to breathe. Michael sat up, letting the cold floor press against his feet. Something was calling him, though not in words, and not from within the cabin. The puppies stirred as if sensing his movement, but they settled quickly again, absorbed in the uncomplicated urgency of sleep. He put on his coat, hesitated at the door, and glanced once more toward the fireplace. His fingers brushed the frame of a photograph on the mantel, the one he had never taken down, but rarely looked at directly. A younger version of himself stood with his old team, faces shadowed by the sun overhead and the weight of missions that blurred together. He traced the edge of the frame and whispered a name he had not spoken in months, then drew his hand back sharply, annoyed that memory still commanded him so easily. Outside, the snow muffled every sound, turning his steps into mere hints of movement. The storm's chaos had been replaced with a stillness that felt almost accusatory, as though nature itself waited to see whether he would break the silence first. The cold bit at his skin, but he barely registered it. His attention was fixed somewhere beyond the trees, pulled forward by a lingering thread of worry he could neither cut nor ignore. He followed faint traces along the tree line, marks so subtle he wondered if his mind invented them out of need. But the snow had been disturbed in a way that suggested movement rather than wind. Soft depressions heading away from the cabin, irregular and uneven, as though whoever left them had been fighting exhaustion with each step. Michael slowed his breathing to sharpen his focus, letting instinct replace doubt. In war, decisions like this determined survival. Here he did not know what was at stake, but his chest tightened with a sense that something awaited him, and he would not forgive himself if he refused the call. He moved deeper, into the woods, where fallen branches trapped powdery drifts, and the air felt strangely hollow. The quiet became heavier the farther he walked, until it seemed his own heartbeat echoed through the snow-laden pines. A sharp memory rose without warning. Another freezing dawn on another continent, wounded comrades waiting for rescue that did not come soon enough, silence growing thicker each minute. He shook the memory away, but its shadow clung to him, unwilling to fade. Then he saw it. Not movement, not sound, but a shape barely visible beneath a massive cedar where snow gathered like a heavy blanket. Michael stopped breathing for one painful second. He stepped closer, boots sinking deep. The dog lay curled tightly around a small, motionless shape, its body forming a circle that shielded the fragile life beneath from wind and cold. Only when Michael knelt beside them did he realize the puppy was still alive, breathing faintly against the warmth offered by its mother. A wave of conflicting emotions struck him: relief, fear, frustration, admiration. And behind them all, a quiet grief that he did not fully understand. The dog did not lift its head immediately, as though torn between instinct to protect and exhaustion pulling it downward. Its eyes finally opened, revealing a dullness that was not defeat but depletion, the look of someone who had given beyond what was reasonable. Michael felt his throat tighten. This was not just survival, this was sacrifice carried to the edge of self-destruction. He whispered softly, though words felt unnecessary. He told the dog he was here now, that it no longer needed to carry the burden alone. He did not know whether it understood, but something in its gaze shifted. Not full trust, not surrender, but the faint recognition of shared weight. Carefully, as though touching a piece of his own past, Michael lifted the puppy first, feeling its tiny heartbeat flutter like an unsteady drum. It was warmer than he expected. Saved by the body wrapped around it through the long night. When he reached to lift the dog itself, it did not resist, but he sensed how close it was to collapse, how thin the line was between life and something quieter. Michael held them both against his chest as he stood, and for the first time in many years he felt the unmistakable weight of responsibility press into him, not as punishment, but as purpose. On the walk back to the cabin, the woods seemed to watch him, branches bowing slightly, as if acknowledging the fragile procession. The air was cold enough to numb thought, but his mind raced regardless, circling a truth he tried to avoid naming. He could feel it in every step, in every breath shared between himself and the life he carried. Some part of him was waking up again, though he feared what that awakening would demand. At the cabin doorway, he paused, shifting the puppy gently to his other arm so he could push the door open. Warm air met his face, carrying the quiet sounds of the other pups. The familiarity of the cabin should have grounded him, but something inside still trembled as though he sensed another shift waiting to unfold. He placed the rescued puppy among its siblings and knelt beside the dog, letting it rest near the fire without forcing contact. He did not know whether to speak or remain silent, but his thoughts were loud enough to drown out the crackling flames. What if he had not gone outside? What if he had stayed asleep? What if some part of him had remained closed to possibility? The questions clawed at him, each whispering the same lesson he had spent years avoiding. Presence could save, but absence could kill. Hours passed without him noticing. The dog slept, breathing faintly, the puppies stirring against each other for warmth. Michael sat nearby, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the flames. His heart beat a little faster every time the dog shifted, as though life itself now demanded vigilance from him again. When dusk approached, a quiet sound drifted from the tree line outside, a sound too distant to place, too soft to name. Michael stood slowly, one hand resting on the table to steady himself. For a moment he thought it might be the wind, but something in him insisted otherwise. It sounded like possibility returning. He took a careful breath and stepped toward the door, sensing that tomorrow would not be as still as today. Anchorage rested under a muted sky, the softened light of early morning pressing against frost-covered windows, as though unsure whether to enter or turn back. Michael Hayes stood at the cabin table with his phone in his hand, thumb hovering above a name he had not dialed in years. The cabin was quiet except for the shallow breathing of the puppies and the faint rasping breath of their mother. The night had passed in slow fragments, his attention drifting between the fire and the weight of exhaustion tugging behind his eyes. He kept glancing toward the dog as though worried life might slip away when he looked elsewhere. The need for help gnawed at him, a truth he could not unlearn. Some burdens demanded more than solitude. The name on the screen felt heavier than the device itself. Dr. Samuel Carter. Once a military physician who had worked beside special operations teams, now tending animals in remote corners of Alaska as though saving smaller lives could repair the scars left by losing larger ones. Michael inhaled carefully and pressed call before doubt could harden. The line clicked after a few rings, and a voice carried through, low and alert, as though the man had never stopped waiting for emergencies. Michael said his name simply, without apology or unnecessary explanation. There was a silence that felt like acknowledgement rather than surprise, followed by a short reply that he would arrive within the hour. Michael ended the call without ceremony and felt the familiar pull of anticipation settle in his stomach, not the dread of battle, but something quieter, the discomfort of opening a door long kept shut. While waiting, he paced the cabin in unhurried movements, adjusting blankets, checking bowls, stoking the fire as though prolonging warmth could fend off whatever fear lived behind his ribs. The puppies stirred occasionally, nudging each other with half-formed instincts. The mother dog shifted only when necessary, eyes opening at the sound of Michael's steps, but closing again once she recognized the rhythm of his presence. Her breathing remained strained yet steady, as though her loyalty was stronger than her weakness. Michael knew endurance when he saw it, and he felt a faint echo of something he had once believed defined him. A truck engine cut through the stillness, stopping outside with a low rumble that grew quiet, almost too quickly. Michael opened the door before a knock came, and there stood Samuel Carter, carrying a medical pack slung over one shoulder. The two men exchanged a look that did not require greetings. Years of shared history spoke louder than words, shaping the silence between them into something neither hostile nor warm, but necessary. Sam stepped inside and took in the scene with a practiced glance. He did not ask questions about how the animals arrived here. He merely knelt beside the dogs and began working with the same calm precision that once steadied wounded soldiers in dust-choked tents. Michael observed, from a short distance, hands resting on the arm of a chair to ground himself. Watching Sam move awakened memories he had tried to bury, medics rushing toward explosions while others ran away, hands soaked in blood that did not belong to them, voices that stayed calm even when hearts broke. He wondered whether Sam also felt ghosts stirring beneath his pulse, or whether time had hardened him differently. Sam spoke occasionally, his tone measured, offering short updates rather than explanations. The puppies, though underweight and dehydrated, showed resilience. Their mother's condition was more concerning, but he believed rest and nourishment might restore her strength. When Sam finished his initial assessment, he rose slowly and faced Michael. The weight of their past lingered unspoken. Sam's eyes held the same guarded steadiness Michael remembered from deployments, a look that belonged to someone who had seen too much yet continued anyway. Michael gestured toward the table, offering coffee in silence. Sam accepted with a nod, and they stood side by side without seating themselves, cups warming their hands as though both feared what sitting down might signify. Sam finally spoke, not to question Michael's involvement, but to acknowledge it. He said the animals were alive because someone decided not to look away. Michael almost responded, almost confessed that looking away had once cost lives he never stopped carrying, but the words refused to leave his throat. Instead, he asked how long recovery might take. Sam gave measured answers, emphasizing the need for routine care, warmth, and vigilant observation. Nothing in his voice judged or assumed. He simply mapped a path forward. Michael felt relief and pressure simultaneously. Responsibility no longer weighed solely on him, yet sharing it stirred an unease he could not easily categorize. When Sam packed his equipment, he paused, studying Michael with an expression that hinted at questions beneath restraint. He asked how long Michael planned to stay in Anchorage. Michael gave no clear reply, stating only that winter had kept him here longer than expected. Sam nodded once, as if understanding more than was said. He placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, a gesture so brief it almost vanished in the space between breaths. Michael tensed instinctively, memories flashing of field hospitals where such touches preceded news no one wished to hear. But Sam's grip carried no warning, only recognition. When he released his hand, he told Michael quietly that saving these animals would require patience. Michael wondered whether Sam was speaking only of the dogs. After Sam left, the silence returned, accompanied by a dull ache that Michael could not name. He checked the fire again with unnecessary urgency, then sat near the mother dog. She lifted her head and met his gaze, her eyes reflecting fatigue shaped by devotion rather than surrender. Michael reached toward her slowly, stopping just before contact, allowing her to choose the distance. She did not move away. In that stillness, Michael sensed the faint resurgence of something he feared to acknowledge, the fragile possibility of connection. Hours passed, marked only by the settling of snow outside and the soft sounds of sleeping puppies. Michael cleaned the small area near the hearth where blankets and makeshift bedding lay, movements steady and deliberate. The routine steadied him, tethering his mind away from darker places. As dusk approached, shadows stretched across the cabin, and firelight drew trembling reflections along the wooden walls. Michael sat back, exhaustion finally scraping against his bones. He let his eyes close briefly, listening to the rise and fall of soft breaths. Then a subtle change in sound caught him, faint yet unmistakable, a hesitant rustling outside the cabin, not forceful enough to alarm, but persistent enough to demand attention. Michael opened his eyes, breath sharp, every sense alert. For a moment, he remained still, waiting to confirm whether the noise belonged to wind or to something returning. He rose slowly and turned toward the door, pulse quickening with something almost like anticipation. The morning arrived without sunlight, only a muted glow that pushed weakly through a sky still heavy with winter's breath. The air inside the cabin clung to the faint warmth of the fire Michael Hayes had tended through the night, though exhaustion weighed on him more than the cold. He had slept little, drifting in and out of uneasy rest, his senses tuned not to distant threats as in the past, but to the fragile cadence of the puppy's breathing. When he finally rose from the chair, stretching limbs stiff from vigilance, he noticed one of the smallest bodies stirring oddly, its movements wavering like a flame struggling against wind. He knelt beside the makeshift bedding and watched the pup fight for breath, chest rising too fast, too shallow, as though life were slipping through it faster than it could be held. A sharp pressure grew behind his ribs, old instincts igniting without permission. Assess, stabilize, do not hesitate. He whispered reassurance to no one in particular as his hands moved gently, adjusting the blankets, offering water, hoping warmth could coax strength back into the tiny form. But with each passing moment, the pup's tremors deepened, its breaths shorter, as if some unseen weight pressed relentlessly downward. Michael felt a tightening in his throat, not of panic, but of recognition. This sensation he knew too well, the moment when presence alone was no longer enough. He reached for his phone without allowing doubt to intervene, and dialed the number saved from yesterday. Samuel Carter answered quickly, his voice sharper than before, as though he understood urgency even through silence. Michael spoke few words, but Sam needed none. He promised to arrive as soon as possible. The minutes that followed stretched painfully, each second marked by the weakening rhythm of life before him. Michael kept one hand gently against the pup's small chest, feeling each tiny heartbeat, not as something fragile, but as something determined to stay. He murmured steady phrases he had once spoken to wounded soldiers long ago, though back then his voice had been colder, more controlled. Now it trembled not from fear of failure, but from the unsettling realization that he cared more than he thought possible. When Sam's truck finally pulled up outside, the engine's rumble broke the suffocating quiet of the cabin. Michael opened the door quickly, guiding his old friend inside with brief words. Sam knelt beside the pup without removing his coat, his focus shifting instantly into the rhythm of practiced intervention, hands steady and sure. Michael hovered near him, unable to sit, unable to stand still, watching closely but trusting Sam more than he trusted himself in that moment. Sam issued calm instructions, warm compresses, controlled feeding, careful stimulation to encourage breathing. They worked together in silence except for short commands, each movement purposeful. Michael felt time wrapping around them like a closing circle, pushing out memories he could not push away, the scent of antiseptic in a makeshift shelter, the roar of distant explosions, Sam's voice ordering him not to let go of someone whose name he never forgot. The past was not welcome here, yet it arrived regardless, riding on the rhythm of Sam's calm persistence. When the pup's breathing deepened slightly, Michael exhaled with such force that he startled himself. It was not victory but reprieve, a reminder that resilience did not choose sides between human and animal. Sam shifted slightly, rolling his shoulders as though shaking off ghosts. He looked at Michael only then, his voice low, almost apologetic in its honesty. He reminded Michael that some lives cling to the world with everything they have, yet still lose their grip. Michael bristled instinctively, not because the truth hurt, but because it echoed words he had once spoken to others while hiding how deeply they wounded him. He did not respond. Instead, he focused entirely on the pup, watching its breaths deepen just a fraction more, sensing a fragile return. Hours passed without them noticing. Sam guided the pup's recovery with an attentiveness that bordered on reverence, and Michael supported his efforts with hands that had not been this steady since his final deployment. They spoke little of the past, yet its weight sat between them like a third presence neither could dismiss. When the pup finally opened its eyes, unfocused but alive, Sam sat back and let out the quietest sigh, a breath that seemed to release both tension and remembrance. Michael swallowed hard, feeling something within him shift, though he dared not name it. He placed the pup carefully beside its siblings, watching them instinctively nudge closer as though welcoming the small fighter home. Michael felt heat gather behind his eyes, though no tears fell. Instead, he let his hand rest against the floor, grounding himself in the solid wood beneath his palm. He whispered a thank you, not to Sam directly, not to fate, but to whatever force had pulled him from isolation in time to witness a heartbeat refuse to surrender. Sam stood slowly and asked if Michael had eaten, his tone light yet carrying a deeper question beneath it. Michael brushed off the concern with a brief nod, though both men knew the answer lingered unspoken. Sam gathered his equipment without ceremony, only pausing once to adjust a blanket draped over the mother dog. His movements carried neither pity nor obligation, only the recognition of shared weight. Before stepping outside, Sam placed a hand on Michael's arm, steadier than the day before. He told Michael softly that strength could be measured not only in endurance, but in willingness to stay, even when staying hurt. Michael turned away slightly, unable to meet his gaze, fearful of admitting how deeply the words struck him. After the door closed and Sam's truck rumbled away, the silence returned, but it felt different, less like isolation, more like space waiting to be filled. Michael sat beside the fire once again, letting warmth seep into his hands. The pups slept in a loose pile, tiny bodies rising and falling with new steadiness. The mother dog lay nearby, her gaze watching not out of suspicion, but vigilance formed through instinct and past trials. Michael felt the weight of responsibility settle in a way that no longer suffocated. Instead, it anchored him. He leaned back, resting the back of his head against the wall. His breathing slowed, matching the rhythm around him, though his mind refused stillness. Memory pulsed beneath thought, reminding him of battles fought, lives saved, lives lost. Yet for the first time in years, his reflections did not paralyze him. They simply existed, sharing space with something new, the faint pull of purpose drawing him forward. As dusk seeped into the cabin, the fire crackled softly. Michael closed his eyes briefly, only to freeze moments later when a sound drifted in. From outside, faint, irregular, neither wind nor animal. A low, dragging noise, almost like someone or something moving through heavy snow with determination rather than strength. Michael opened his eyes, pulse sharpening. He stood slowly, gaze fixed on the door. The pup stirred, sensing tension, but not understanding its source. The mother dog lifted her head slightly, ears barely twitching, her gaze drawn toward the same place. Michael's heartbeat grew louder in his own ears, though he could not tell whether it signaled dread or anticipation. He waited, breath caught halfway between inhale and release, wondering if the sound outside signaled return or loss, or the thin line between them. Morning unfolded slowly over Anchorage, pale light stretching across rooftops and frozen branches as if the sky itself struggled to wake. Michael Hayes stepped outside the cabin before the fire had fully caught, letting the cold sting his lungs in a way that felt grounding rather than harsh. The strange noise from the night before lingered in his thoughts, not as fear, but as unfinished business. He scanned the tree line where snow still hung thick on the boughs, yet nothing moved except wind sliding past branches like breath withheld. Inside, the puppies slept close together, their mother watching them with half-lidded eyes that revealed more resilience than fatigue. Michael returned to the cabin and knelt beside them, listening to the soft chorus of breathing, the faint rustling of new life growing stronger. He felt that same tension as before, pride mixed with dread, hope tangled with memory. Sam's words from the previous day echoed without invitation, reminding him that staying could hurt more than leaving ever did. He wondered if Sam had meant the animals, the past, or something neither of them dared to name. The hours passed in quiet tasks that demanded attention but left room for thought. Michael cleaned feeding bowls, restocked blankets, and carved a small wooden box to hold medical supplies Sam had left behind. He noticed how his hands moved without hesitation now, as though following instructions that lived somewhere deeper than muscle memory. The cabin no longer felt like a bunker against the world, but like a space learning to breathe again. At one point, he stepped outside to split wood, the rhythmic swing of the axe soothing in its simplicity. Each strike echoed faintly between the trees, scattering birds that took flight before settling again. Michael paused between swings, letting the smell of pine and frost fill his senses, and realized he had not felt this kind of calm in years. It frightened him, though he could not explain why. Perhaps he feared that calm might vanish the moment he trusted it. Inside, the mother dog tried to stand, but faltered. Michael moved quickly, steadying her without touching too much, giving her space to choose how much support she accepted. Her eyes flicked toward the puppies, and Michael felt something inside him shift again, the recognition that devotion could anchor strength even when the body weakened. He whispered something reassuring, though he wasn't sure whether she needed the words or he did. Around midday, sunlight finally pierced the cloud cover, scattering across the frozen clearing like shards of glass. The brightness startled Michael, forcing him to squint as he stepped outside. The tracks left by Sam's truck had softened, nearly erased by drifting snow, as though the world wished to hide evidence of every departure. Michael stared at the road longer than necessary, recalling the countless times he had watched someone walk away, unsure whether he wanted them to come back or stay gone. He returned inside and brewed coffee, the aroma filling the cabin with unexpected warmth. He drank slowly, seated near the fire, while the puppies chased each other clumsily, stumbling over their own legs. Their mother watched with weary vigilance, her gaze softening each time one bumped into another. The scene tugged at something fragile in Michael, stirring memories of moments he never allowed himself to revisit. Voices laughing around campfires, shared meals between missions, fleeting connections that felt like family until distance and silence consumed them. He closed his eyes briefly to steady himself. Later, he stepped outside again and walked the perimeter of the clearing, checking for signs of the dog's return. He found none, yet the absence did not feel empty. It felt like a pause, as if winter itself had stopped to see what he would do next. He crouched to brush snow from a fallen branch and noticed faint indentations nearby, too soft to identify clearly. They could have been left by an animal or simply shaped by the shifting storm. Still, they pulled at him. He knelt longer than necessary, fingertips grazing the snow's surface, yearning for certainty where none existed. When he finally stood, he inhaled deeply, preparing himself for the possibility that the dog might never return, or the possibility that it would. Both prospects tightened something in his chest. Back in the cabin, Michael fed the puppies, watching them eat with determination that bordered on defiance. One of them yelped with impatience, and Michael couldn't stop a small smile from forming before he forced it away. He caught himself wondering what each might become once grown, a thought that frightened him if only because it implied a future he would have to witness. He paced the cabin restlessly afterward, unable to shake the drift of his own thoughts. He wondered whether the sound from the previous night had been real or merely memory dressed as presence. War had taught him that ghosts visited in many forms, and not all of them belonged to the dead. When twilight crept across the clearing, turning the snow pale blue, Michael lit the lanterns and checked each animal again. The mother dog lifted her head slightly when he approached, breathing steadier now. He whispered that the storm had passed, though he knew winter would return again, as it always did. Still, saying it aloud made something ease inside him. As the fire crackled, Michael sat cross-legged on the floor, carving wood absent-mindedly into shapes he did not yet recognize. His hands stilled when he heard the faintest tap against the window. He lifted his head sharply, breath suspended between doubt and belief. The wind could have caused it, yet the sound felt deliberate. He rose slowly and walked toward the glass. Outside, the snow fell in a gentle curtain, blurring the world into shifting silhouettes. He saw nothing at first, only the reflection of firelight against ice. Then a subtle movement flickered near the tree line, too fleeting to identify, too intentional to dismiss. Michael's pulse quickened. The puppies stirred behind him, sensing the shift in his posture. The mother dog lifted her gaze toward the same direction, her eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. Michael stood motionless, heart beating hard enough to feel in his fingertips. He could not tell whether what he had seen was real or born of longing, but he knew with certainty that waiting was no longer something passive. Winter had paused, holding its breath along with him, and somewhere beyond the tree line, possibility moved again, just enough to keep him standing there, staring into the falling snow, afraid to blink in case the world changed while his eyes were closed. Dawn crept gently over Anchorage, thin light stretching along the frozen clearing as if winter itself paused to measure what had survived its passage. And Michael Hayes stood at the cabin window, watching the trees with the same careful patience he had learned in the field. The faint movement he saw the previous evening had left him uncertain whether memory or instinct was guiding him, yet something in his chest urged him outside before the day settled into silence again. He stepped into the snow without hesitation, the air sharp enough to tighten his breath, but not enough to turn him back. The forest remained still, though the quiet felt different from the days before, less like absence and more like anticipation. Each step drew him deeper, past trees bowed under snow, past the familiar clearing where he once found the dog curled around its pup, and for a moment he feared the trail of life had ended without warning. Then, just beyond a narrow ridge, he heard a soft sound, quiet, yet deliberate, like breathing held too long, then released. He followed it carefully, listening, until he recognized a rhythm belonging not to wind or memory, but to a creature that refused to surrender. The mother dog rested against a fallen log, her head lifting slowly when she sensed him, her gaze steady but distant, holding an exhaustion that reached into her past and reminded him of soldiers who returned from missions with bodies intact and spirits scarred. Michael knelt nearby, leaving space between them, understanding that closeness was earned, not taken. He whispered that the puppies were safe, that they slept with the warmth she had given them, that their breaths were stronger now because she had chosen endurance over escape. The dog's gaze softened slightly, not in gratitude but in acceptance, and Michael felt something uncoil inside him, the tension that had kept him on the threshold between isolation and connection, loosening at last. He reached forward slowly, placing his hand on the snow rather than on her, offering presence instead of demand. For a moment, nothing changed. Then the dog shifted her weight, as if preparing to stand, but her legs faltered. Michael moved closer without hesitation, lifting her gently, sensing the fragility of her strength and the resilience beneath it. He carried her back toward the cabin with deliberate steps, each movement steady, as though transporting a burden that was precious, not because of weight, but because of meaning. When he reached the door, the pups stirred at the smell of their mother, emitting small sounds that felt like greetings after long separation. Michael laid her near the fire, arranging blankets carefully, and sat beside her while the pups nudged close, guided not by instinct alone, but by memory of warmth that shaped their earliest breaths. Hours passed in soft quiet, interrupted only by shifting embers and the restless movements of young life learning to stand as Michael tended to them all with the patience Sam once claimed he still possessed. As daylight reached its peak, Sam returned unannounced, his knock brief but familiar, carrying supplies in a small box and questions he did not speak aloud. Michael let him inside without comment, and they worked again in calm synchronicity, assessing each pup, listening to the mother dog's breathing, adjusting food and warmth as if tending a fragile engine of survival. Sam spoke little, but when he finally met Michael's gaze, he offered a simple truth. He believed the mother dog would recover, though time and continued care would be required. Michael nodded, feeling relief rise in his chest, tempered by the understanding that responsibility did not end with the crisis. The two men shared coffee by the fire afterward, silence resting between them not as a wall, but as a bridge that did not require words. Sam told Michael he had been offered a temporary role supporting veterinary care at a small shelter in the nearby valley and asked whether Michael would consider helping. The request was phrased casually, yet Michael sensed what lay beneath, an opportunity to remain present rather than drift backward into the shadows he once chose. He looked toward the puppies, then toward the mother dog whose awareness drifted between rest and vigilance, and recognized that staying no longer felt like surrender. It felt like choosing. Sam did not press him for an answer, leaving after ensuring everything was stable, but as his truck disappeared along the snowy road, Michael felt the decision forming long before words shaped it. The cabin no longer resembled a refuge built to hold back the world. It felt instead like a beginning forged quietly through responsibility and fragile connections. Days passed in steady rhythm, marked by feeding schedules, careful cleaning, and watching the puppies attempt uncertain steps over uneven floorboards. The mother dog regained strength slowly, and though she kept a cautious distance, she did not turn away when Michael sat nearby. He spoke to her occasionally, short statements about weather or tasks or memories that surfaced without warning, and though she could not answer, her stillness felt like permission to speak truths he once buried. As winter softened into early thaw, snow receded enough to reveal dark soil beneath the white, and Michael walked outside with the mother dog at his side, her movements measured but determined. He brought her to the edge of the tree line where she paused, breathing in faint traces of the path she once traveled alone, then turned back toward the cabin. Michael understood without needing explanation. She chose to stay. In the days that followed, he carved a small sign from wood, left stored in the shed, shaping letters with quiet deliberation, letting each stroke reflect the journey from isolation to responsibility. When the sign was finished, he placed it above the cabin door where sunlight caught its edges as the season slowly changed. It read Winter Haven, a name that felt less like a label and more like a promise to what had survived and what would continue. On the final evening before Sam returned again, Michael sat by the fire as the puppies curled into a pile of unsteady sleep, and the mother dog rested with eyes half open, watching without warning. Michael felt the gentle exhaustion of completed effort press against him, the sense that what needed doing had been done, not perfectly, not easily, but fully. He allowed himself a long breath, one that did not tremble or falter, and when he exhaled, he felt the weight of unspoken grief and fear lift just enough to let him recognize what remained. He stood, walked to the door, and looked outside at the clearing where winter still lingered, but no longer dominated. The cold remained sharp, yet it did not bite the same way, and Michael realized that what had changed was not the season, but the place he occupied within it. He stepped back inside, closing the door gently, not to shut the world out, but to protect what had grown within. The fire crackled once more, the dogs breathed steadily, and in the quiet of that final night, Michael felt something he had not allowed himself for years, a sense that his life had not ended with war, but had simply been waiting for the moment he chose to live again. Miracles do not always arrive with thunder, lightning, or a chorus of angels. Sometimes God sends them quietly, in the shape of a tired mother dog at your doorstep, asking only for warmth and offering faith in return. Michael believed his story had ended long ago, buried under battlefields and winters of silence. Yet, through one small knock from a life in need, God whispered to him, "Your heart still has work left to do." In our everyday lives, we often move too quickly to notice the gentle ways God reaches for us. A chance to forgive, a moment to listen, a stranger who needs your patience, or someone who reminds you that compassion can still heal. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Let someone else remember that kindness is never wasted. Leave a comment about the smallest miracle you've witnessed in your own life, and don't forget to subscribe so we can keep telling stories that carry hope where it's needed most. May God bless you, protect your home, and fill the cold seasons of your life with warmth and purpose. And if winter ever returns to your heart, I pray you will remember, sometimes heaven knocks softly. All we need to do is open the door. God bless you. Stay warm, stay kind, stay faithful.